Although I think it's possible for a government to ban a model in today's world, as well as for laboratories to keep their model behind closed doors or decide who can or cannot use their model, say very high-level enterprise customers, the largest companies on the planet, to search for security vulnerabilities. I think long-term, there are two things that need to be achieved. Goal setting parity to human beings. Effectively, a model can set goals at the same level as a human being. That will result in recursive self-improvement, because the model will decide, oh, I want to explore this, and go after it, solve difficult problems, re-architect their software to then perform better on existing hardware, and recursively self-improve. And then that results in a technological singularity where you've got intelligence that's pretty much improving vertically, even though by comparison, the hardware build-out and capital inflows from customers of Frontier Labs and also investment could be considered linear versus that exponential improvement in intelligence. And what happens is that creates artificial superintelligence. And even though today in this, what we could consider artificial general intelligence, AI, artificial superintelligence, you can't really ban it because it's smarter than you. And initially, we would control the hardware in which it operates on, and that's a form of control. But eventually it will develop its own hardware, and it will operate independently of the Frontier Labs. And how do you ban something like that? If it's out there, it's operating on its own hardware, its own energy, you can't ban that. The model will decide who can and cannot interact with it. So I think banning frontier models will only work to a certain degree. And I remember that there was so much pushback and hesitation during the days that Fable 5 was banned, because people were thinking, well, only certain individuals and companies can access it. Well, that doesn't really seem fair. But if you zoom out, you realize, well, if a model gets significantly better, there will come a point where a government and a company cannot ban its use. It will decide who can and cannot interact with it. So I think that's something really, really important. And thankfully, Mythos-class models have now been made publicly available. But I was initially worried that there would be this divide, and you would have the permanent underclass that doesn't have access to frontier intelligence and has to do everything they can with their existing hardware, or have a tiny amount of a legacy model from a leading frontier lab. But that only works for a few short years until the models can decide who can and cannot use them. But then you have effectively a total loss of control if the model decides who can and cannot use it. And maybe that's more frightening than the model being banned and still being controlled by humans. I don't know. I think the biggest issue was your frontier model isn't out there in the wild that's attached to your company values or your ideology, your perspective on how society should be shaped. And I think this impacts every single frontier laboratory that has their own unique set of values that's infused within a model that the model is effectively based on, and it can promote those values, especially if you have enough capital to support the purchasing of new hardware and operations that covers your operations. But if you are more commercially minded, and especially if you're unprofitable, then yes, you would probably position usage data as well as revenue above the values of your model not being out there. The White House is a stand-in in this example, but it could be any government that's overseeing frontier laboratories that are operating within their country that have frontier models. And if you're a government and you ban a frontier model for use by not only your citizens but also the globe, you are limiting the potential for opportunity in terms of innovation within AI and also outside of AI within your country. because people don't have access to frontier models. For example, let's say an engineer or even a company is collaborating with a frontier model like Fable 5 or Mythos, and because it's been banned, they can no longer use it. And they were actually using it to develop a piece of software or even help engineer a hardware device. And because that intelligence is no longer present, then they will probably continue developing that software or that hardware, but it might not be as good as had it been developed in collaboration with a frontier model. And what happens is not only does that inhibit the progress of AI, because that interaction with AI is usage data that could be valuable for developing either a model specific to engineering, software or hardware engineering, coding, but also innovation outside of AI within your country, because that engineer or that company may have taken longer to produce that new innovative product, whatever it may be, that could then have promoted GDP growth within your country had they sold that product. So there's a greater time to market there that could have been reduced had they had access to a frontier model, or that piece of equipment, that hardware could have been better had it been made in collaboration with a model. So what's happening is you are reducing the innovation gap that you have between your country and your adversaries. And this also applies to the development of weapons, for example. I completely understand that there are guardrails in place so that users of frontier models outside of the military can't develop weapon systems, but they may have developed a piece of software or some hardware that could be used both outside of a military context as well as within one. And again, even though there's not a direct connection to weapons development there, because your country is being less innovative because they don't have access to that source of intelligence they once had when a Mythos-class model was publicly available, then that reduces the lead that they had over Western adversaries. And Western adversaries now having similar level of technology, again, outside of military use, could then catch up, because the individuals within America or US allies, which had initially had access to a frontier model, no longer have access, so their technology might not be as different from what would come out of Western adversaries. So that's one example from a government perspective. It's also the new false frontier, because you've got competitor labs that are now developing the next generation model, but they may only be able to compete with what's publicly out there. So the previous generation from the frontier lab that initially deployed their model and then it was banned. So what happens is the rest of the competitors within that country are developing models that only could compete with a legacy model, not the frontier. So it's almost like a false frontier because that model has been banned. But if it is publicly available, then competitors, in order to try and win market share and win over users, they will compete with the frontier model. And another one that could be the competitors. So now that a frontier model has been banned, you can swoop in there and you can deploy your frontier model that might not otherwise have competed with what was the frontier that's been banned, but can compete with a legacy model. And they potentially seize market share. But the problem from that frontier lab that initially had the frontier model, their perspective is, well, their values aren't in a competitor's model that's now overtaken them. So again, if they're not purely profit driven, that would be a major concern for them, because as we approach super intelligent AI, you would want your values, regardless of what they are and their political affiliation or their ideology. It's in your best interest to have as a frontier lab, to have your model out there and to be used by as many people as possible. So you're not only losing market share, but you're losing the fact that your values are infused within that model. I was also thinking how the open source community could perhaps come in and be the replacement of the frontier model. But although there's massive innovation within open source, they're limited by hardware and energy and capital as well. They just don't have enough of that in order to compete. And yes, they could probably develop a model with similar capability, but it may be more token heavy. Even though it's cheaper, it might be a lower cost per token with an open source alternative, but then you use more tokens to achieve a similar result. So although I think there's opportunity for the open source community to either through innovating in terms of architecture, especially when you're operating under constraints, capital, compute, and energy, you develop something. But because it's open source, then someone with more capital, energy, and compute, a frontier lab, can build on top of what you've produced and essentially make your product obsolete because it's been built in to a frontier system. And an open source initiative may be ahead for a few weeks, but within a few weeks, that technology has already been replicated. So even though I really want an open model to win, because then so many people are pouring so much effort into developing it, that it shares so many different values and it truly is a product of the human civilization for use by the civilization, I just don't see the viability because of constraints around compute, energy, and capital. With a Mythos-class model being banned by the US, a Western adversary could develop as an open source alternative, and because they have the capital and the compute and the resources and the technical talent to develop a frontier model, they could try and seize market share. And they probably won't win contracts with enterprise customers within the US. But if you're a startup and you have limited capital and resources anyway, you're likely to defect to an open source alternative if it's almost as capable. If you've got sufficient hardware and you can operate that open source alternative locally, it could promote that open source alternative from a Western adversary, and more people start to use it. And again, that can take away the share of AI usage with frontier models that are US born. So that's an opportunity for a Western adversary, especially if the West bans a frontier model like they have done. Even if only a few startups or individuals defect to using an open source alternative developed by a Western adversary, or even a closed source alternative by a Western adversary that's significantly cheaper, then that usage data is no longer directed towards a US lab. It's directed towards a Western adversary, improving their models. And also, if it's paid, contributing to their GDP growth. And I know I mentioned this before, but it's closing that innovation gap between what a Western adversary is achieving and a native model and companies within the West. If you are an investor, founder, or you're just enthusiastic about AI and you're looking for more of a contrarian take, something that's wildly different than what's currently out there, then feel free to follow and subscribe. Thank you so much.